Henry,
Katya.
a huge honor for me. I was not even hoping that I will catch you on your way from Odessa, where you were successfully in the clinic of our friends in Odreks, talking about something. You will tell me about what?
Yes, well, we were talking really about empathy, end-of-life care, about behaving well towards patients and the problems introducing that into Ukrainian healthcare.
So before this air started, you said that your relatives and friends think that you are very brave, which you don't think so.
Nonsense.
So are you brave or not
No,
that
I'm
you're
not
coming
brave
to
at all,
Ukraine?
but I know the risk to me is very small. You know, Odessa, Kiev, these are big, big cities. You know, a few missiles, anyway, most of them are shot down, so it does not worry me at all. But my wife is in a permanent state of anxiety when I'm here, and I promised her I would not go to Odessa, so I've broken my promise, and I've not quite yet decided whether to continue to lie or say, well, actually, Kate, I did go to Odessa, but it's really very safe. You know?
So you don't feel anxious at all?
No.
Not at all?
No. I mean, if there was an explosion, when I was here in October of the year of the full-scale invasion, I arrived at the main Kiev railway station at exactly the same time as the first cruise missiles. So as the train drew into the station, there were some enormous explosions. And I don't remember being frightened. I remember being very sort of sharp, clear, everything suddenly was very intense, but I wasn't frightened. Maybe I was just naive. Maybe I should have been frightened. Maybe because I've had to come to terms with having cancer. Maybe, you know, death does not worry me too much. I don't know. Maybe I just don't get frightened easily, but I'm normally a fairly anxious person.
So I promised myself that I will be asking you totally random questions about everything. Were there any, I'm trying to put it correctly in English, at which stages in life or at which circumstances in life you started to perceive love in a different way? What changed your perception of love?
I think when my first marriage fell apart and it brought out I behaved badly. My first wife didn't behave very nicely either. But I learnt some very, very painful lessons about myself, and that love is about not what's good for me, it's about what's good for the person you love, you know. It's got to be give as much as take, and love can be very, very selfish. And I think the end of my first marriage was very, very traumatic and very difficult. And I think it made me a much better person, because I realized actually I'd behaved badly, and I still feel bad about it.
If you would be asked what is the most romantic book you ever read since you were a kid, or several romantic books, and how it was changing and evolving through life, what was it?
Well, probably children's books, I think. I mean, romantic in terms of love, I never really... I remember when I was a teenager, I read Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, and I remember being very affected by that. Now I don't read very much fiction now. I'm not terribly keen on Hemingway now. Romantic books. Gosh, I really have to scrape my head on that one. I tend to read non-fiction, terribly serious books all the time. So recently, I read so much I lose track of it all. I can't think of anything to hand. But in terms of poems, I love some of the Shakespeare sonnets. I think some of the Shakespeare sonnets are some of the greatest love poems written.
How your attitude to friendship changed or evolved through life?
I've always had a small number of very good friends. I'm not a very sociable person in the sense I hate going to parties. I don't like big events of any kind, but I always have one or two friends with whom I feel, both men and women, to whom I value greatly. I think one of the great benefits of getting older and becoming an old man is I now have some very, very good women friends, often near the age of my daughters, 30 or 40 years younger than me, and there is nothing sexual to it at all. And to have a woman as a very, very good friend and sex is totally irrelevant is I think a great joy. And it's very difficult to do that when you're younger and still sexually active, at least in theory.
Did your attitude to sex changed? I don't mean sexual interaction, but I mean that gender of people, their sexual
Yes, I was
habits
brought
or
up in
something.
England with traditional prejudices and jokes about homosexuals. And, you know, I've learnt the total stupidity of that. But I still am aware of my immediate reaction with homosexuality is to feel a bit uncomfortable. But then I overcome it, and I have some friends who are homosexuals, and it doesn't bother me at all. In fact, I think gay liberation in Western countries must have done more for human happiness than almost anything else I can think of, you know. So many people had to suffer terrible sort of self-disgust, low self-esteem, just because their sexual preferences were not approved by St. Paul, you know. So I think gay liberation is absolutely wonderful.
When you think about success, all the competitive things, like, oh, I am more successful than you as a doctor, for example, or something like that, is it relevant or not? What it is for you now?
Well, I was very lucky that I went into medicine quite late. I did a different degree at Oxford University in politics, philosophy and economics, and I was almost 30 years old by the time I became a doctor. So I always felt a bit of an outsider, a bit looking in from outside. So I was ambitious and competitive, but I've never really felt I quite belonged to the medical profession in a funny sort of way, which is also, I think, this being a bit of an outsider, which enabled me to write my books, which are, you know, looking from outside in many ways at myself and my work as a doctor. I was always very ambitious. My anthropological wife, my second wife, who's a very well-known anthropological writer, says I'm a typical alpha male silverback gorilla. It's not that I don't want to boss people around. I'm not a bully. I hate ordering people around, but I want to be in charge in a sense, and I want to be influential, and in a good way, I think. Now, at the age of 74, obviously in many ways, people would say I have been successful both as a doctor and as a writer. I'm pleased with that, but the really important thing is what will I do next? You know, I'm much more concerned about the future than looking back and feeling pleased with myself. But of course, by the age of 74 and with cancer, which probably isn't cured, I hope I'm still in remission, but I'm not sure at the moment. No, I don't have very much future left, probably. Anyway, as you get older, your capacities and mental powers do tend to decline a bit. I don't think mine have yet, although I joke about this in my third book, looking with horror at my brain scan and all the microvascular damage and white matter hyperintensities on my MRI brain scan. I also realize, as many people do, as they reach the closing chapters of their life, that your family means more than anything else. And as with many grandparents, I'm totally in love with my grandchildren. I was not a very good father because I was always away. I was always working. And I regret that, but that was the way things were then. But it was also my choice as well. I'm not going to blame the system. I think I'm extremely lucky that I have a good relationship with my 3 children now, and also with my first wife, and our 4 wonderful grandchildren, although, you know, God knows what sort of future they face. when I think back to the world 50, the world I grew up in 60, 70 years ago, where will the world be in 60 or 70 years? You know?
What makes you a good grandfather? What makes a person a good grandfather?
Well, my daughters say I'm a better grandfather than I was a father. I think being fun, telling stories, being a little bit crazy, doing exciting things. I built them a tree house in the garden, our country cottage, and I've made dolls' houses for them, for the girls. My grandson now is only 2 years old, so he's very fond of each other. But I've yet to start doing things with him. The great advantage of being a grandparent is that you have all the joys of childhood without any of the hard work that's left to their parents.
You are not hiding that you have cancer.
No.
What was your, feeling when you were told that you have cancer?
Oh, complete panic, distress, panic, despair. I was very, very upset. I was embarrassed at how upset I was. I felt, as a doctor, I should have been much more philosophical about it, but I wasn't. And I'm still very, frankly, very bothered by the idea of it coming back. So I haven't really come to terms with it. I think that's part of my rather anxious nature. Rationally, that's ridiculous. 74, actually, the risk to me from my advanced prostate cancer in terms of life expectancy is not really very different from the fact I'm 74 years old. But I think, as in many human beings, I have this built-in conviction that somehow I'm going to live forever or want to live forever, which is totally ridiculous, but hard to get rid of. And I suspect that actually it was sort of built into our brains by human evolution, because in the millions of years ago, nobody lived into their 70s or 80s.
You didn't reject treatment, you went through the whole
No,
treatment?
I went through it all, yeah.
What helped?
What helped? Physical exercise, and I had castration treatment, hormone therapy for 2 years, which I'm off at the moment, though I think I may have to go back in it. Physical exercise, I think, is incredibly important for all sorts of reasons, but it's psychologically very as well.
So you were doing something every day as a physical exercise?
I run 6 days a week. Yeah.
And you now run six days a week?
Yes, well, I haven't done it this week in Ukraine. I brought my running kit with me, but I've had a very heavy cold, which I'm only getting better from now. But I'll be in the Carpathians at the weekend, so I might go for a run there.
Again, you didn't hide that you had first marriage and second marriage, so I will be asking you some personal questions, and you will reject me whenever you feel. Do you remember that point? Because I guess how old were you when you were getting married second time?
Second, I was 50.
50. Do you remember this moment when you decided, okay, yes, this is my person. I want to be with this person.
It was
seriously.
a gradual process. Kate and I met after my first marriage had ended. So it wasn't as though Kate was the woman who broke the marriage. We had a long... we both were very curious about each other, and we're both in our own ways unusual people. Kate was and still is incredibly beautiful and also incredibly clever, but she has terrible health. She has Crohn's disease and epilepsy, and only weighs about just over 30 kilograms. But we started exchanging emails, and it really was a sort of courtship. She says it's like in Jane Austen, we sort of wrote long emails to each other. And I went up, she lived in Oxford, my hometown, although I lived in London. I went to visit her once. And then I was going to Moscow, and I remember very clearly, I was running around the local park where I go for short runs, and I was going to fly to Moscow the next day, and I had my mobile phone with me, and I rang her up and said, look, I've got to come and see you. I'm going to Moscow tomorrow. I want to come and see you before I leave. And I drove up to Oxford immediately, and we basically swore undying love to each other. But that was after sort of 6 weeks of emails, and only having met 2 or 3 times, always in somebody else's company.
Is it scary to live with somebody smart? really clever?
No, not at all. I mean, I've learnt so much from her, and she's my best critic for everything I write. I've learned a lot about, the anthropological way of looking at things. She says she's learnt from me, from my medical and scientific knowledge. I mean, it's true that when I show her things I've written, she always makes some very good criticisms. And I always get very cross, but she's always right. And then I grumble, and she's always absolutely right.
How did you start writing books?
Well, you see, my books, when I'm asked, why did you write your books, I can honestly say, because Kate, my wife, told me to. Because I've always kept a diary virtually every day of my life since I was 12 years old. And I'm now faced by the problem of what to do with it. I'm inclined to throw it away. It's not very embarrassing or personal, but I don't want my children to have to deal with it. But it's very hard to throw a diary away, and it's me. Anyway, so after Kate and I started living together, she would say, what were you doing at work today? And I'd pull out my laptop and read a bits of the diary. And she said, that's got to be a book. Go and see my literary agent. So 10 years later, the first book appeared.
We have quite often in various events the medical audience of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And usually in 100 people, 2/3 would know who you are, and
Yes.
1/3 have read your books because they are translated into Ukrainian.
Yes.
So if you would be advising somebody how to read your books, from what to start, what should be first, second, third?
Oh, I think they should be read in the order they were published in.
Chronological.
Yeah, the chronological order, yes. Because that directly reflects the progress of my own life.
Are you now in the middle of writing another one?
No, I mean, the last book is called And Finally, because basically I feel I've said everything I want to say about myself, and it's getting boring, I don't want to write a book about living with cancer. It's boring. So many people have done it. I was interested in writing about discovering I had cancer and then becoming a patient, having been a doctor. I found that was quite funny and quite ironical and interesting. But I've no wish to write about when the disease comes back, what it'll be like. There are loads of books written like that anyway, and they're boring. The problem is I love writing, and I would love to have something to write about. I've started writing during the pandemic, and I couldn't see my grandchildren, the two older girls. And every night I'd tell them fairy stories of my own invention on FaceTime with my smartphone. And it was 2 years, almost a new story virtually every night. Or sometimes it was a series of stories about an imaginary, slightly crazy world I'd invented. So I've started to write those up. Whether they'd be publishable or not, I don't know. But I just write them up for the family archives.
If you would be writing about Ukraine, what would be the book about?
Well, I mean, there's quite a lot about Ukraine in all three books. And my initial work in the 1990s, when things were so difficult, and I worked with a very dynamic, energetic, fanatical surgeon Kurelets. And then the second book I discuss how it all fell apart. I found I had to stop working with him. And now, of course, there's the war, and there's a short postscript at the end of my third book, which I was finishing writing just as the full-scale invasion started. So I do think about that. I mean, it's, having been coming to Ukraine for 32 years puts me in a very unusual position. But I don't speak the language. Everything I hear and see is also hearsay. And you know how it is, the more you know about something, the more difficult it is to reach any conclusions. So I was just writing about Ukraine in my diary today. And again, you're always coming up with unique, unusual situations. We were in Odrex, and Tigran and the chief medical officer were being presented by somebody whose name I forget, with 2 medals from the Ministry of Defence for their help with the program of training combat medics and first aid. But at the same time, behind this guy who was reading out this sort of notice from the Ministry of Defence, and there was this huge flat screen TV which had CCTV feeds of all the rooms in the hospital. And there was a gynecological operation going on behind. It was just a very Ukrainian sort of wacky situation, which I thought was rather funny. You know. When I come to Ukraine, there's always something. The English word is, well, I love the country, I respect it enormously. I'm just amazed at how the country has raised itself up against the Russian invaders. But also, there's also slightly wacky, slightly left field. There's also something rather amusing going on, which I like. I love it.
You were born after the war.
Yes.
In your childhood, do you remember the war to be romanticized?
By the English, yes. We won the war, the Royal Air Force, Battle of Britain, all that crap. Yeah. I mean, yes, Churchill and Britain played a crucial role by not making peace with Hitler when he invaded Poland. And that was, I mean, there was many voices in England were for appeasement, for continuing appeasement. And that was Britain's great contribution. But obviously the war was won by the combination of Russian numbers and American economic military might as well. The war was romanticized. I also had a slightly nuanced view of it because my mother's brother, my uncle, was a Luftwaffe Messerschmitt pilot. My mother was German. My mother was a refugee from Nazi Germany. But I've always had a sort of deep admiration for many aspects of German culture, but obviously not for the Nazis. But the war was romanticized, yes, and there's nothing romantic about war. But that having been said, the bond of brotherhood which soldiers experience is very intense. It's not something I personally have any experience of, but I've read quite a lot about it, partly in the context of post-traumatic stress disorder, partly the books written by a very, very impressive American journalist whom I met recently. I was interviewing him, called Sebastian Junger, who wrote a very striking book called Tribe about American forces in Afghanistan, and how, you know, one of the problems with post-traumatic stress disorder is the bond of brotherhood between fighting soldiers is so intense. When you leave that, it's quite difficult to adjust to a totally different level of life again in civilian life. So, you know, war is horrible, but it does appeal to young men, at least in principle, before they realize what it's like. You know, we all know the First World War, all the countries in Europe were demonstrating, we'll be home by Christmas, you know. And of course, yeah, but war brings out the worst in people as well as the best.
You said that your mom was a refugee.
Yes.
Now a lot of people in Ukraine are refugees,
yes.
either
Yes.
moved in the country, for
Yes.
example,
Yes.
from the places which are occupied by Russian forces, or are abroad.
Yes.
How do you remember this feeling about your mom being a refugee?
Well, my mother, she wrote a very good book, an autobiography, which we had printed privately, about her childhood, because she lost everything. She came from a small family. Her sister, who was a fanatical Nazi, was killed in the air raid towards the end of the war. She was in Jena. Her mother died from breast cancer during the war. Her brother was shot down and was a prisoner of war for many years and became an alcoholic, probably partly because of being locked up in a British prisoner of war camp for, I think, 6 years. Her hometown of Magdeburg was completely destroyed by the British in an air raid one night in January 1945. It's not just the family home was destroyed, the whole street was destroyed, because my brother and I took our mother shortly before she died. This was now 14 years ago. We took her back to Magdeburg and to go back to show us the places where she grew up. And this completely eradicated. So, and it was a family with very few relatives, or they'd all been killed. So she completely lost her past in her German childhood up to the age of 19, when she was in trouble with the Gestapo and managed to come to England. And yet her childhood, until the Nazis, was very, very happy. Even in the 1920s of hyperinflation and everything else. I mean, she had a very, very happy childhood. And then it all went completely to hell.
Do you remember yourself as a child of a refugee, or not at all?
No, not at all.
Not
no,
at all.
Not at all. She spoke very, very good English. Only if she was very tired, occasionally a slightly German accent would come out. No, I never thought of that. I never thought.
Do you ever felt yourself as a German person?
I've never. No, because I'm the only member of my family who doesn't speak German, which is something I'm very ashamed of. My brother speaks wonderful German. But all I can say is, when I was at school as a 7 or 8-year-old, in the school playground, all the little boys are running around being Spitfires, you know, the famous British fighter plane. I was running around being a Messerschmitt, you know, which showed I was into provocation and being controversial and drawing attention to myself from a very early age.
What are, for the moment, according to you, the biggest topics, narratives in the world now? Peace, anti-Semitism,
Well, medium to long term, it's climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And that's happening already. And of course, immigration is going to become an even bigger problem because of climate change. I think immigration is a huge problem for the Western countries, and also countries like South Korea and Japan. The indigenous population, the local people, are all shrinking. Women are having fewer than 2 babies each. And the European countries need migrants. And this fundamental truth is obviously being totally denied by right-wing populists. And immigration is a huge issue. It's a huge issue in America with Trump. It was really probably the driving force behind the lunacy of Brexit. It's behind AfD in Germany. So it is a huge, huge problem. And the war in Ukraine, if all it meant was that Russia took over part of Ukraine and that was the end of the story, you might say, well, it's not a big deal. But of course, that's not the case. I mean, if Putin is successful in any way, you've got, North Korea, Iran, China, is a green light for autocracy everywhere. And although these autocrats dress up their talk in populist politics, essentially they're just these vile, power-crazed bullies. And that is why I believe passionately the war in Ukraine is literally a war for civilization and a rules-based order. Each time I talk this visit, I've been there now for 8 days, at some point people will want me to say something encouraging about the present situation. But there's a very good American military strategist. He's an academic, he's a professor, in fact in Scotland, called Phillips P. O'Brien. And he's very, very pro-Ukrainian and very critical of the way, from a military point of view, the Western media are reporting the war, giving the impression of this relentless Russian advance. I was just reading a piece by him this morning, pointing out that in 2024, the Russians have taken over 0.25% of Ukraine at the cost of tens of thousands of soldiers and masses of military equipment. I mean, the Russians actually are not doing very well, but the Western media say he's gaining these strategic cities and everything else. So I find that quite encouraging. But the problem, obviously, is America and the election, because, you know, Ukraine needs proper military support, and at the moment it's a bit lukewarm, and everything is in sort of stasis, paralysis until the election. And the problem there is it may well be the result of the election will not be clear for many weeks, because the Republicans, if, God willing, Trump loses in the Electoral College, apparently are planning all sorts of legal complaints and procedures to drag it all out for a long, long time. So we may not have a clear answer on November the 8th.
If you would be advising some of your friends now to travel to Ukraine and learn about Ukraine, what will be your advice? To go first to which city? To try which food? To see what?
Well,
what would be the logic of the advice of the very experienced traveler in Ukraine?
Purely in terms of tourism, Lviv is very accessible. It's near the Polish border. It's relatively safe. There have been a few missile hits, and that terrible one 2 weeks ago when the family was killed. And Lviv has this unique old Habsburg charm. Kiev, I think, is a very beautiful city as well, in a different sort of way, as is Odessa. But I think people, in the war, people would be more nervous. If there was not the war, I would recommend a round trip to Lviv, Odessa, and Kiev. I've not been further east than Chernihiv, so I've not been to Donetsk or Luhansk. I was in Crimea, although it's not exactly in Ukrainian hands at the moment, many, many years ago, and obviously Crimea is pretty fantastic.
At some point, I think that you...
Oh, food, by the way, is Salo. Salo and gherkins and Khurilka is a very good combination. I'm supporting with my friend Rachel Clark, we're helping, we raised money to help palliative care doctors here in Ukraine. And I visited last week a very nice hospice in Sambia near the Polish border. And the hospital director gave me some extremely good summer honko, which I had with Salo later that day.
Suicide. I know that you were publicly speaking about it.
Well, the movement arguing for it prefers the name assisted dying rather than suicide. Suicide conjures up lots of... There's euthanasia, there's suicide, there's assisted dying. In the English, in England, the phrase used is assisted dying, and a bill is going through Parliament at the moment. Opinion polls show a huge public majority in favour of it, but there is a small group of mainly palliative, older Christian palliative care doctors who are passionately opposed to it. My argument is that, first of all, it's quite clear in a medically reasonably well-developed country like England that despite good palliative care, dying can still be a very distressing experience for many people and for the families. So the families are left with pretty bad memories. Most people don't want assisted dying, but a small number do. That's the first. So there is a need for it, in my opinion, but not for a large number of people. The arguments raised against it, that it will lead to exploitation, bullying, coercion, well, that really is a question of evidence. And there are so many countries now where assisted dying is permitted. I mean, Spain, Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, Japan, Canada, many American states. There really is no evidence that it is leading to coercion of so-called vulnerable people, that lonely old people who are depressed and unhappy are being hastened to a premature death by callous doctors. It just doesn't happen. And again, the point is assisted dying is not about euthanasia. It's not licensing doctors to kill patients. It's about patient autonomy. It's about choice. And all of us would say most of us would prefer to die at home peacefully with our family without pain. And it's the loss of dignity and autonomy that dying often involves, which many of us find unappealing. And again, in my situation, I must have operated upon hundreds of old men with prostate cancer which has spread to the spine. You know, if that happens to me, which it might do, and I end up paralyzed in bed in hospital, I don't want to be like that, you know. I'd rather get the end over with, you know, subject to safeguards. In all the countries where assisted dying is allowed, you have strong safeguards. You know, people, you have to be quite clear the patient has a clear mind, you know, they're not demented, they're not depressed, haven't got a psychological illness, and this is a definite wish, and you don't give it immediately. It's not suicide on request. Usually there's a delay. You have to ask for it twice, you know, and see maybe one or two independent.
Listening to you, or what it is when you feel that you are loved?
Oh, a hug from my grandchildren, I think. I'm not a very physical person. I don't like being stroked or anything like that. But a loving hug with grandchildren. And it's also, even now being a sensitive new age guy, I even hug men occasionally now, although it's not my natural posture. But physical contact, I think.
You said that this attitude towards the assisted death is subject sometimes with regard to the decision of paternalistic doctor. Yeah. If we step back from the question of death or not death, and just speaking about the doctor, where is this border where the doctor is caring and where he is paternalistic, according to you?
Well, I mean, the principal idea is that doctors should make decisions with patients rather than for patients, which means the doctor must explain as clearly as possible what the options are and come up with a recommendation. I do not believe in this business of these are the facts, you decide. As patients, we want advice from an expert, and clearly quite often there are situations in medicine where, particularly some of my brain tumour work, I really didn't know what the right thing to do was. The evidence was not there. And yet if you tell patients, I don't know, that can be very frightening for the patient. Patients want certainty, not so uncertainty. And yet as doctors, of course, we deal with everything is uncertain. We never know exactly what's going to happen to the individual patient in front of us. So it's one of these very difficult areas where a lot of it depends just on your manner, how you talk, things like that. Patients want support, they want guidance, but again, ultimately, you mustn't tell them what to do. You can say, this is probably the best thing to do. You have to listen, and of course a very important part of communication is listening.
Do you feel British?
I feel English. I mean, I'm not a patriot in the sense I'm sufficiently well read in the British Empire to have no great pride in what Britain and the rest of Europe did to the rest of the world over the last 300 years. So I've always been rather sceptical about patriotism and nationalism. I'm proud of the English empirical philosophical tradition of, keeping things the writing style of keeping things simple, not writing great big long flowery complicated sentences like the French do and the Ukrainians do to a certain extent as well, having had their minds fucked by years of Marxism, Leninism. I like the English. British means, I suppose, Scottish and Welsh and Irish, but I'm a great believer in devolution. I think the Welsh and the Scottish should have as much independence as possible. But because I'm half German, I know my manner, the way I behave is very, very English. I went to very classical, very good English schools and Oxford University. But ultimately, having travelled all over the world, and I regard myself as a human being first, But I can see that I'm a European, and that's why Brexit was so painful for me and everybody else like me.
Languages you speak?
It's shocking. I did years of Latin and Greek at school, which was the English tradition then, but I've forgotten it all, or most of it. I spent years doing French, but the French would look at me with such disgust if I tried to speak in French. I would just shrivel like a little flower. So I don't dare to open my mouth in France. Anyway, Kate is bilingual, my wife, so won't have been in France.
Very convenient.
I leave her to do the talking. So that's a big regret of mine. I really regret not speaking German, and I regret not speaking Ukrainian. But by my age, I can speak a few words of Ukrainian, but on the whole, it goes in one ear and out the other a few minutes later. But I can read the Cyrillic alphabet fairly fluently now because of Google Translate. So some of my Ukrainian friends, their English is pretty terrible, so we communicate on our smartphones with Google Translate.
Patience. You said that in Odrax, this week in Odessa, you were speaking on how to behave with patients.
Yes.
What was it about?
Well, the question was phrased in terms of the word empathy. Strictly speaking, the English word empathy means to actually feel what somebody else feels. So if you stuck a pin into your hand, I would see that and flinch, So there's a grey scale going from empathy to compassion, sympathy, concern. There are lots of words which suggest a diminishing scale of emotional engagement. I think the traditional medical model, which I think is still basically the case in Ukraine, was described in English as being detached concern. You were concerned professionally for your patient's well-being, but in a detached way. You were not emotionally involved. And now there are many voices, particularly in America, saying that's the wrong model. Doctors have become cold and callous and indifferent, and we should practice a model of engaged concern, where actually you try to understand your patient's feelings and understand their illness and the context of their life story, which is fine, maybe, for some specialties. But if you do the sort of work I did as a neurosurgeon, where you have to make these very difficult decisions, which your patients usually accept, but you might get it wrong. You have to take responsibility onto your own shoulders. So that if the patients suffer because things don't go well or you can't help them, you'll see many patients in brain surgery you cannot help. If you get too involved with patients, you can't do the work. It's too painful, obviously. You have to protect yourself to some extent. And getting that balance right is very, very difficult. And it clearly must be an important part of being not a doctor, but being a good doctor, being, sympathizing with your patients, and not just as a matter of professional principle, but because you actually care for them as fellow human beings. And getting that balance right is very, very difficult. I mean, you struggle with it throughout your career. The problem is more often, particularly with surgeons become too detached. They become more like mechanics or technicians. And that would be fine, maybe, if the operations they did were simply like fixing a car. You don't have to be emotionally engaged with the owner of a car, whose car you're fixing. You just get a new spare part and plug it in. But medicine isn't like that. It often doesn't work. Things don't go according to plan. And you cannot you should not just push away the psychological element what your patient and their family are going through.
Speaking about psychological, we have as UNICEF a project of psychological support for doctors and nurses where we find psychologists, we pay for them, and everything is confidential. In your view, what is the situation where you would argue that the doctor or nurse should go to psychologist? In which case you would say...
Well, I had 2 periods of psychotherapy myself, once before I was a doctor, and also when my first marriage was falling apart. I found it very, very helpful. I think all of us are better off for a bit of psychotherapy from time to time.
Why? Tell more about it a bit.
Because we are our own, in a sense, we are our own worst judges. We're too self-critical. We think you think your problems are unique and it's all your fault and you're a failure, when in fact you're just a normal human being. And life is difficult in the modern post-Neolithic world, you know. I think we were all happier in one sense when we were hunter-gatherers in the African savannah hundreds of thousands of years ago. I think life is very difficult. And medicine is very difficult. I think when I was talking about this yesterday at Odrex, I was saying I think one of my many points in my lectures is having good colleagues is incredibly important. Medicine is difficult. The only people who really understand how bad you feel, how upset you feel when patients come to harm, and particularly if you blame yourself for it to some extent, the only people who really understand are your fellow colleagues. So having good colleagues is the first step, and not being ashamed of struggling and understanding it's normal for doctors often to get pretty upset. And then if you're in a war situation here, the stresses are all that much greater.
I know you have a garden.
Yes.
What is, I even don't know how to formulate it nicely in English. What is important for you from this surrounding beauty? Do you have, I don't know, vase and you cut the roses and put them into vase?
Well, I don't cut the roses, but I have a garden in London. My family have a small cottage in the Welsh Hills with a rather rough garden, but a beautiful landscape of trees and hills. I once planted a forest of 4,000 trees in Devon in the years of my first marriage. It's still there now, you can see it from Google Earth. So that was nice. No, the famous American biologist E.O. Wilson talked about, biophilia, that love of living things is built into us. Hard to prove, but I've always been a great proponent of trying to have hospital gardens or pictures of trees and flowers and growing things. It's of enormous therapeutic value. What is so tragic about climate change, as I reach the end of my life, you want to feel nature will carry on regardless, that nature is an absolute. I do not have religious faith. So for me, really, my religious faith is the idea of an unchanging nature continuing beyond my life. But, there was a publication last week saying that in the last 50 years, 73% of wildlife in the world is gone. There's been a huge decline in garden birds in England. I used to have lots of sparrows in the garden. I had a song thrush and the sparrows and goldfinches. They've all gone in the 25 years I've lived in my house in London. And this is really very, very terrible.
And what is important for you from all these small, nice things? Dogs? Birds?
Dogs? Sorry?
Plants?
Roses? I do woodwork. I keep bees. I love my bees. London honey is very good because of all the gardens of flowers. And I've always done woodwork. I make furniture. I make toys for my grandchildren. So making things is hugely important for me as I have to be busy all the time. I think psychologically I'm a bit like a spinning top. You know, if I stop spinning, I'll fall over. So it's a constant fight against nudno. My life is a long fight against nudno and boredom.
You said that you are very interested in perspective, in what is next.
Yes.
What is next? What are your plans? What
Well,
would
that's
you
what
like
that's
to
what
do?
I don't know, you see. Partly because I don't know the status of my cancer at the moment. This year, much of this year has been spent abroad lecturing, which I'm sort of both rather proud of, but also a bit ashamed of because of carbon footprint. I think I've Mexico twice, Spain twice, Ukraine twice, Albania, Kathmandu, Nepal, and Istanbul, all lecturing, not tourism, but
The same topics?
yeah, and that's the other problem. It's a different audience each time, but I've heard this before. It's so boring, you know, so I can't go on doing it forever. And because I no longer work as a doctor in England, you know, I'm not really talking about clinical things. So I think my time as a medical lecturer is starting to come to an end, because I've said everything I have to say. I've got nothing very new to say. So I need to think more about, you know, focusing more on, and I'll go on supporting Ukraine as much as I can. Rachel Clark and I have this charity. I support quite a lot of charities in England. So I think my days of travelling around the world will probably come to an end. But I can't see very far ahead at the moment, to be honest.
For those who don't know about Rachel Clark, tell about her.
Well, Rachel, after I published my first book, I got a letter from Rachel via my literary agent saying, could she meet me? This is now 10 years ago. And she had been curious parallels between us. She had studied politics, philosophy and economics at Oxford, as had I, although I'd been there 20 years earlier. And then she became a journalist and documentary filmmaker for one of the main British television channels, not the BBC. And then she had a sort of crisis and decided to become a doctor. Her father was a family doctor, just as I had a sort of crisis and decided to become a doctor. So we had a lot in common. We were both sort of outsiders that come to medicine late. And she became a palliative care doctor. And before the pandemic, I'd thought it'd be very interesting, and I talked to Andrew Mizak about this. I said, no, I'm sure palliative medicine in Ukraine could do with a bit of help, because it developed hospice movement, palliative care, was very much an English creation. But then there was a pandemic and then the war, so I wasn't able to come out with her to Ukraine until 2 years ago. And she is a sort of human dynamo, complete ball of fire. She immediately said, we must start a charity to help our colleagues. So and Andrew had arranged for us to meet some palliative care doctors here. Palliative care in Ukraine has a slightly different meaning from England and the rest of the world. In England and America and Europe, it means specifically people who are going to die usually within the next few weeks or months.
So it's like end of life care.
It's end of life care. Here, palliative care is more sort of people who are no longer being treated but need long-term care. In England, we make a distinction between hospices for people who are dying and care homes for people who need to be looked after but are not necessarily going to die in the near future. And here, the hospices seem to be more like sort of a mixture of end of life and also long-term care. So we started a charity. Well, Rachel did all the work, really. And we raised about $100,000 in England from, we had a big event at the Royal Society of Medicine. And now we started sending some of the money here. And I hope to meet one of our colleagues, I think on Thursday, just to see what's happening. I'm not a palliative care doctor, so it's not my thing. But it's very nice to feel I can try to. I've got nothing more to tell neurosurgeons in Ukraine. They don't need my technical advice any longer. I greatly enjoy lecturing to medical students. I was lecturing on this visit in Venezia, which was great. It's quite clear medical students like me, and I think that's not it's part of the silly celebrity thing, but it's because just as doctors we have to pretend to our patients we are certain and confident and completely in control, we also pretend to younger doctors and medical students. So, and as medical students, as young doctors, we are often quite anxious and stressed. And to hear an older, senior doctor like me talking openly about stress and psychological problems and difficulties, I think they find quite helpful, perhaps.
Mental health. Everybody is now talking about mental health
Yes.
in Ukraine and
in
globally.
England too, the royal family are heavily into talking about their mental health.
What do you think about it?
Well, I think life is difficult, and life is becoming more difficult.
Why?
Well, not just the war, but things are getting faster and faster, things are changing more and more quickly. Social media, advertising, images, everything is more pressurized, more uncertain. And also, I think there is a certain sense of doom around the corner with climate change, even at a subconscious level. So I think life is very, very difficult. And again, it's not in Ukraine, but in certainly in many of the Western countries, the strength of family support groups is not as strong as it was, So on the other hand, of course, it's always very difficult to make these comparisons and how you diagnose mental health, and there's lots of arguments in the West. Is it mobile phones and social media, etc., etc.?
Which topic in healthcare you think is now the most important?
Establishing really good primary healthcare and prevention.
Why?
Because hospitals are expensive, over-treatment is a big problem. It's much better to prevent ill health in the first place with good primary healthcare than trying to pick up the pieces years later in hospital.
But people are always saying about it, primary healthcare this, primary healthcare that, and something is not functioning. What it is that is not functioning?
Well, I don't know. That probably is not being set up properly. There was this wonderful paper from Norway published, which has a very strong primary healthcare system, looking at the entire population of Norway, showing that people who had the same family doctor for more than 1 year, basically had a 25% less risk of dying, fewer hospital visits, fewer call-outs at night. Having a good family doctor is really important and as gatekeepers to the specialists. But it needs to be properly financed, properly trained. It's got to be established well.
What's the biggest topic for hospitals in your opinion now?
Well, it's a very easy answer to that. Over-treatment, not knowing when to stop, is a big problem in America. Maybe less. Well, it can be a problem here as well. Going on ventilating patients and there's no hope of a useful outcome. Certainly in England, over the 40, 50 years of my practice, I get the impression my young colleagues are not very good at knowing when to stop. They worry, oh dear, people might criticize us, this, that, and the other, rather than having a straightforward, open conversation with the but often it's in neurosurgery, it's the patient's family rather than the patient. The patient will be in a coma to actually say, look, it's time to stop, But that's getting more and more difficult to do. So over-treatment is a big problem.
Coming back to books, you wrote several books. We have one intensive care specialist from Odessa Oblast, Ivan Chernenko, who wrote one book in Ukraine about how to be a medical student, how to be a doctor. Which
I've heard about it, yes, I haven't read it.
Which is very, very cool.
Yeah.
What would you advise to other doctors who are writing a book about something?
Well, criticism. Show what you write to other people and get it criticized. My first daughter is a novelist who's had her first novel published and did very well. But she did a master's in creative writing, probably the best creative writing course in England at the University of East Anglia. And there you write something and then you sit down in a room with all the other 10, 12 students and read it out, and then they comment on it and criticize it. As I said earlier, everything I wrote, my wife looked at. In fact, my first book, the first draft was about that thick, and then Kate went through it and it was that thick, and then my literary agent went through it and it was that thick, and then my editor, my publisher's editor, went through it and it was that thick, and every time it got better. So writing is a technical skill. You're not going to write well if you haven't read a lot. The idea just that, just because I've got something interesting to say or my life is interesting does not necessarily mean to say you can write well about it. So it takes, you've got to read a lot. I'd be very surprised if anybody could write a good book if they weren't very enthusiastic readers in the first place. But showing what you write to other people, listening to criticism. And when I write, I'm always writing as though I'm reading it, aloud and listening to it. It's like talking to patients. You're having to try to put yourself in the patient's position and hear yourself talk and think, what am I trying to communicate? So writing is rewarding, but it's difficult. And there are lots of really bad books written by doctors, because they all get sent to me in England by the publishers, hoping I will endorse it. Sometimes I do, but not very often.
Why to become a doctor at all now?
Oh, I wanted a professional middle-class career, but not of my family's choosing. It was an act of rebellion to a certain extent. I liked using my hands. I wanted to be practical. I just felt I would be happier in life doing something practical rather than being a university professor or academic, which would have been probably what I would have done otherwise.
But if you would be talking to somebody, I don't know, in Ukraine right now, why would you say a person should become a doctor?
Well, I mean, you have to, I mean, medicine doesn't suit everybody. I think it's wonderful to be a doctor. It's incredibly interesting, incredibly rewarding. There are so many different types of medicine, ranging from, pathology, psychiatry, public health, to brain surgery, and nonsense like that. That it's very unlikely you won't find something that doesn't suit you. But what all medicine has in common, apart perhaps in pathology, is our patients. And I just find people very, very interesting. And as I mastered the technical sides of the work, I find that what was really interesting was the patients, the people, and the enormous privilege of helping one's fellow human beings. It comes at a terrible price, of course, because you often get things wrong. And in retirement, I only remember my failures. I cannot remember any successful operations. I can only remember the ones that went badly. But it is, I suppose, the English word I'd use is it's so meaningful. Making lots of money, frankly, is not meaningful. You might have a big car and go for holidays on the Costa del Sol, but when you look back on it, it's pointless. It doesn't create anything.
Your wife is an anthropologist.
Yes.
You don't hear in Ukraine quite often the word anthropology, except if it is some, I don't know, very special circles. Yes. What is anthropology?
You have to ask my wife. Well, it's the study of human society, emphasizing observing. It's not very theoretical. The model is what's called participant observer. So you go and live with a group of people and ask them endless questions. Why do you do this? And there are so many things we take for granted in day-to-day life because we just take that in, we learn it automatically without questioning. An anthropologist is there to ask, well, why why are you behaving in that way? And then it gives one great insight into human society and human nature.
Which book your wife wrote?
Well, she wrote one book on English social etiquette in pubs, and there are lots of rules you learn without realising it. And she wrote a huge bestseller called Watching the English, which in fact has been translated into Ukrainian, about English behaviour.
It was translated to Ukrainian.
Yeah. It's a very funny book about English behaviour, why we seem slightly mad. She received several letters, mainly from Americans, saying, "You saved my marriage. I thought my husband, my wife was mad. I now realise they're just English." But now she is about to publish. She has spent 10 years working on this book, very controversial book, about social media and human evolution, and why the way we use our technology and social media, the way we use it really has been largely determined by the way our brains developed living in small groups of hunter-gatherers in the Great Rift Valley in Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago. It's a very, very interesting book. It's amazing.
So the last two for today.
Yes.
Shoes. You always have the same shoes.
Yes.
What is the story of these shoes?
Well, I fell down the staircase. I did my own loft conversion in London. I built the space into the roof I turned into a room. This involved putting enormous steel beams up. I mean, in retrospect, completely mad, but it worked. And I made a nice oak dub staircase up, and I polished it very hard, thinking a staircase should be like a tabletop, because I've made many tables. And then, of course, it was far too shiny, and I slipped and broke my foot, broke my ankle. Which one did I broke that one. There was a fracture dislocation, so the foot was out at a right angle. It was quite painful. And then my neighbours took me into my own hospital on a Sunday afternoon to the emergency department, where there's a sort of bulletproof glass window with a hole in it and a very fierce looking woman. And you have to register. She said, I was in a wheelchair with my foot out at right angles. Name? I said, Henry Marsh. Date of birth? 5th of March, 1950. I am actually the senior consultant neurosurgeon here. Religion? Came the reply. So I thought, well, they're very, very egalitarian here. Anyway, so I had it plated. There's metalwork in it. And then, partly to give it support, I took to wearing these rather classical English brogue boots, which I just become very fond of, and they fit me like a glove. I can't be bothered to buy anything else.
Why Andriy Mezak? Because you spent so much time with him.
Well, I spent years working with Ihor Kurulets on one of my early trips to Lviv in, I think, 1996. Dr. Mezak was a young doctor in the state neurosurgical hospital, and I'd gone to what was then the railway hospital in Lviv to show a modern microscopic lumbar disc operation, which nobody was doing in Ukraine at that time. They all do them now, of course. And Dr. Mezak saw me operating with Kurulets, and then managed to get his professor's permission to come and visit me in London. As I said, come and watch me operate. In those days, 25, 30 years ago, it was very easy. If I said, I've got a foreign doctor coming, the hospital manager would say, fine, that's your choice. But now, with vast bureaucracy, it's really very difficult to bring doctors from foreign countries to come and work with me. I don't do it now, but I did that for many years. I had doctors from all over the world, because I like teaching, and I like making friends all over the world. So Andriy spent some weeks, and he's a slightly, he can be quite a difficult, stubborn person. And to cut a long story short, when he came back to Lviv, he was sacked. But this is a story I saw happen many times when, in the 1990s, when young doctors went to the West, learnt modern medicine, and then came back, and then were a threat to their boss because they knew more about modern medicine than the professor did. So then Andriy started working with Kurelets in Kiev, and I got to know him then for many years. And then when I stopped working with Kurelets in 2015, I think it was, 10 years ago, I started working with him. And the point about Andriy is he is genuinely concerned to try to help Ukrainian medicine as a whole. You know, it's not just what's good for him. And he's very good at making contacts, at networking. And he's a good friend. But we share this wish together, not to, we say in English, feather our own nests or for our own sake, but trying to help all the doctors in Ukraine who want to talk to us and their patients.
What's for you to be happy?
The greatest happiness in life is to make other people happy. My own happiness doesn't last very long. Where was I happiest? I think in the Himalayas. When I used to work in Kathmandu quite for several years, and I'd go on treks up into the high mountains. And it's quite hard getting there, but once you're up there, it's sort of 5,000-6,000 meters. It's just wonderful. It's being in heaven. I can see why they think the gods live in the mountains. So that was pretty good.
Thank you very much for being with us today.
Oh, Katya, it's my pleasure. I'm always happy to be in Ukraine because it gives me an excuse to talk so much. I just wish the situation was a bit more positive. But I'd come back to what I said earlier, that the Russians actually, Putin is not being very successful, actually. In fact, it's a pretty major disaster. So I remain deeply optimistic, but nevertheless, there's lots to worry about.
So I hope to see you soon in Ukraine again.
I'll be back, as Schwarzenegger said. Yes.
Thank you very much for everybody who was watching us.